I'll start off the show today by just talking about Nergal. Obviously, he's the first card in this deck. This is a Nergal control deck. The purpose of it is that it's supposed to be able to slow down enemy rush decks fast enough that you can slowly take over the board and then prevent them from coming back into the game by using good control cards. So to start things off, Nergal, he just starts off with the basic 1/1/1 in all of his stats. His being able to put a poison counter on a creature is not that important in this deck. His special ability is occasionally useful, but not really here. What's most useful about Nergal is the Primal Magic and Earth Magic, and I'll be getting into that later as I discuss those cards in particular, but this combination of spells is actually really good for control decks, and you'll see why in a little bit. And moving on, so again, I want to point out that this is a deck that I copied from Cyriius, who's one of the most respected players in the game right now. He comes up with a lot of really cool decks, and I actually like this idea of including the Sahar Mummy in the deck. I have 3 of them, and the reason that they're good here is because they're like a really effective early game blocker. So for instance, if you start off the game, you know Nergal starts with 1 might, so already as soon as you get 2 resources you can play one of these mummies and he'll completely block the damage from 1 lane. So that's one cool aspect of it, the 1 might requirement. The second thing is that it only costs 2, and the reason that's important is because if you look at all the cards in this deck, there really aren't any 2 cost ways to prevent people from doing things. Like you have Altar of Shadows, which costs 3, Broken Bridge that costs 3, you have Earthquake, and that's the only 2 cost option in the whole deck. So adding these Sahar Mummies just gives you the potential to have a little bit more blocking power early on for 2 cost, and the fact that it can be recycled into your hand every turn is not too bad either. So I'm pretty sure that's why Cyriius included it, and I agree with the call there. I think this is a pretty good option at 2 cost. And then for the only other creature in the deck, there are 4 POW Deathseekers. Now these guys you see have 3 might requirement and a 3 cost. In a lot of decks that you play, what you want to do first is level up might, but that's not the case in this slowpoke or control deck. Usually leveling up might is something that you do last after you level up destiny and magic, but this guy is actually how you're going to be able to deal maybe half of your damage or maybe a little bit less in every game. There are the occasional games where a POW might be a majority of your damage if you're playing different decks, like a Nergal poke with an Atropos to recycle POW Deathseekers. But this game is going to rely on damage from another source, which we'll see again a little bit later in this description. But the POW is just a great card for a deck like this. It gets you 3 damage on the board instantly the turn it's played with Quick Attack. Anytime you can deal damage with Quick Attack is absolutely great, especially since a lot of the time you'll be completely emptying the board from your opponent, and then you'll have an open field to play something. And this also means the fact that it gets played and does its damage right away, that your opponent can't stop the damage from happening. Unless they're able to somehow block the board entirely, you're probably going to be able to get that 3 damage through. So having 4 of these is 12 potential damage in your deck. Often you'll only be using 2 or 3 of these maybe, but it is possible to win without ever drawing a POW as well. But you may be wondering how that's even possible when you only have 2 different types of creatures here for a total of 7 creature cards in the deck, but you'll see why in a little bit. So moving on to the first spell, it is Dispel Magic. There is 1 Dispel Magic in here. The whole reason you have a Dispel is because you want to be able to get rid of, your opponent's Strength of the Sea when they play it. The reason for that is Strength of the Sea is an amazing card, especially when you're playing against a fortune-based deck like this one is, as Strength of the Sea gives all of your creatures Fortune Ward. Now, most people say that you should be running 2 Dispels, and the answer is I am running 2 Dispels. There's also Mass Dispel here. So this destroys all ongoing spells instead of just a single one. But yeah, it's always a good idea to have 2 Dispels in your deck just to sort of increase your odds of getting one, at least in the first half of the game. Hopefully that is soon enough that you'll have it in your hand in case that card does get played. There's also the chance that you might dispel something like a Might of Nature, which could give your opponent's creatures a little bit more staying power. So yeah, I mean, Dispel Magic is a good card, especially if you're playing against someone like Demiria, who plays Earth's Grasp, who makes it so no creatures gain Quick Attack. Yeah, it's pretty much the reason why you would ever play with Nergal as opposed to someone else, just for this Dispel. Definitely provides a lot better stuff. Okay, why was Sean Way timed out in chat? Hopefully that was not an accident. Anyways, moving on, we have Earthquake. This is the early game clear. I've only included 3 Earthquakes, mostly because any more than that and dealing 2 damage to all creatures is not effective. The reason you have this is in case you're playing against a Craghack who starts with 2 Dark Assassins. This is affecting every creature on the board, including your own, dealing 2 damage to all of them. The only reason you include this is to slow down the early rushes with really cheap 1 and 2 cost creatures. Now, the last spell that is in this deck is Stone Shield, and I've included 4 of these, and this is actually probably the spell that benefits this deck the most. This provides you with 1 extra turn where you don't take any damage, unless of course your opponent plays some sort of Dispel, but what Stone Shield does is make it so you prevent all damage dealt to your hero for an entire turn. As soon as your opponent's turn is over, after they've dealt what would have been damage to your hero, the Stone Shield is destroyed, but for 4 turns using these Stone Shields you can actually buy yourself more time so you can get set up for your combos and eventually slow your opponent down to the point where they can't kill you. So that's the idea behind Stone Shield, just buying time. Now we get into Fortunes, which, as you can see here, there are only 7 creatures and 9 spells, so Fortunes make up a good majority of this deck. Now the first one, there's only 1 of these, and it is Shantiri Ruins. This lets you discard a spell card, and then take a non-unique spell card from your graveyard and put it in your hand. So essentially, if you're ever in a situation where you have already used 1 Dispel on an Earth's Grasp, and then someone plays something like a Strength of the Sea, for instance, if you're playing, I guess a Shallan would have that combo, or maybe an Amar, you really need to get that Dispel back. Well, you can pull it out of your graveyard by discarding one of your other spells, like maybe sacrificing a Stone Shield even, just to get rid of that Strength of the Sea. Or perhaps you're playing against someone who doesn't have Strength of the Sea or any ongoing spells, so you can discard your 2, or I mean 1 of your 2 Dispels in order to get one of your Stone Shields back. So you don't want too many of these simply because you only have 9 spells, and you can't just discard spells willy-nilly, but Shantiri Ruins is a very nice card, gives you a little bit of recyclability. It effectively means that you can play Stone Shield 5 times in one game if you need it. Next is Asha Uses All, which does the exact same thing but for a Fortune card. So you take a non-unique Fortune card from your graveyard and put it in your hand, trading one of the Fortune cards from your hand to do so. This is a very important card, as it lets you use Throne of Renewal more times, which I'll get into later. It can let you use more Broken Bridges, and I mean, it's just a really crucial card. But for the most part, you're going to be recycling Thrones. Thrones, you'll see, are one of the most important cards of the deck, and I'll get into that in a second. But yeah, this is a very good utility card that helps you reuse other cards that normally you shouldn't be able to. Now, Ultra Shadows is something else that I also have 4 of in the deck. This is a card that makes it so enemy creatures cannot attack on their next turn. The catch of this, like you see, it is 3 and it only costs 3 destiny. So that may seem a little strong, but the downside is that it can be the only card you play on your entire turn. So you can't play anything else from your hand. You can only play events and your hero card. So yeah, there's a little bit of a drawback there, but this is one of the best early game stalling cards that you draw. In most cases, you want to see at least one of these in your starting hand. These will buy you those crucial turns needed in order to collect the cards to deal damage later on. Broken Bridge is another 3-cost fortune. It returns all creatures in a target row to their owner's hand. Now this has multiple utilities. The first one is that if your enemy has some creatures on the board and you just need to deny him some damage, you can play this Broken Bridge on that row and you can remove 1 or maybe even 2 creatures off the board completely, saving yourself a little bit of damage. So that's use number 1. The second use is you can play a POW Deathseeker, deal your 3 damage, and then you have the potential to Broken Bridge and get that POW back into your hand and then play him right away afterwards, dealing 6 damage. So Broken Bridge has 2 uses there. It's a very, very good card for this particular style of deck where you need to be maximizing little amounts of damage. Recycling POWs can sometimes help you win the game. So Broken Bridge is definitely an auto include in a POW-based slowpoke deck, so I've included 4 of those for that reason. Next is a Campfire, and this card basically just helps you move through your deck a little bit faster. When you have this card, you get to draw a card in its place, and you gain 1 resource. So effectively, this card doesn't exist at all. This helps you get to your more crucial cards a little bit faster, and gives you 1 extra resource to spend at the same time. Now, Arcane Academy lets you search your library, which is your deck, for a spell card and put it in your hand. So there are some points where maybe you just haven't drawn the card that you need. You have nothing in your hand to stall your opponent that turn. You really need to draw a Stone Shield, and you have Arcane Academy. This lets you do that, provided you have the resources needed to play Stone Shield and Arcane Academy. Yeah, this can sometimes bail you out of a few jams. It can even help you if you really need to find a Dispel Magic or something. You can search for it with this card. I've only included 1 because, again, there's only 9 spells in the deck, so you don't need too many. But that's why it's there. Observatory does the exact same thing for fortunes. I've included 3 of them because there are so many times where you'll just draw the crappiest hands and you really, really, really need to get a throne out to completely wipe the board and buy yourself another turn. Observatories are great cards. Yeah, I've included 3 of them, mostly just to find thrones, which we'll be getting to quite soon. I keep talking about thrones. You'll see them in 1 second. Now, Death is Not the End is a new card that came out with the expansion that it's pretty much known as the only good card that Necropolis gained from the expansion. This lets you take a non-unique card from each player's graveyard, so that means any card in this deck, as I have no unique cards, and you put it on top of their library. So the reason this is so good, like obviously you see this sort of does the same thing as like a Shantiri Ruins, but it puts it on top of your library instead, and it also does it for your opponent. Now the reason that's pretty cool is because it lets you pull one of your really, really good fortunes from your graveyard or spells and put it on top of your deck, and it also lets you pull something that would be a particularly bad or useless card for your opponent at the same time. So you can really slow down what your opponent draws by doing this. So a good example would be if you have a Throne of Renewal in your graveyard, you put it on top of your library, and looking at your opponent's deck, maybe they played a gold pile earlier. If you put a gold pile on top of their library, if they're drawing that in turn 11 and they can't play any cards anyways, it's a completely dead card to them. So this is a very, very useful card if used properly. A little bit more expensive than a Shantiri Ruins, but definite capabilities here to help you win games. Included 4 of those. It's a good little card. Now, Tower of Oblivion is actually how you're going to be doing a majority of your damage most of the time. There will be some games where POW deal a majority of the damage if your opponent is somehow really, really good about playing their cards, or if they have any sort of cosmic realignments. But in most cases, Tower of Oblivion is going to be dealing lots of damage. The reason this card works is because it lets you discard cards at random until they have a minimum of 6 cards in their hand. This obviously affects both players, not just your opponent. But the reason this does damage is because you deal 1 for every card that they've discarded down to 6. So the whole point of the deck is to keep your opponent from playing cards and keep throwing cards back into their hand. Some of that we haven't really gone over yet, because those are the cards that come later on. But this synergizes really, really well with the whole theme of the deck, and oftentimes you'll come against opponents who have 20 cards or even more in their hand, so this can deal 14 damage or more right away, which is really, really, really effective, and also really demoralizing for your opponent. I've included 2 of them in my deck just because increases the likelihood of drawing 1 of them throughout the game. If you draw 2 of them, it's kind of a waste, but it's pretty much worth having 2 just to help you get that through. Even though there are observatories, chances are you're going to be needing those observatories to help you stall earlier on, so that's the methodology behind 2. The next card is Cyriius Legion. This lets you take a creature card from your graveyard and deploy it for free. Then search your library for up to 3 cards with the same name and put them in your hand. Now, hopefully you guys can sort of realize what this does. So, for instance, if you've played 1 POW already, you can pull it out of your graveyard and play it for free. Obviously this costs 4, so you're effectively playing that POW for 4 cost. It's dealing its 3 damage. Then at the same time, you can draw all of the remaining POWs in your deck into your hand as well. So you could potentially combo this and play all 4 POW in 1 turn, which is pretty hilarious and also pretty awesome. So that's why this card is here. I guess it should be noted this is a unique card. Earlier I said I had no uniques in the deck, but there is one right here that I forgot about. But it has 2 might and 4 destiny requirement. That 2 might is not really a problem, because if you're taking a creature from your graveyard, chances are it's going to be a POW and you already have 3 might anyways. But yeah, this is a really cool card. The next card is Wasteland, which means you can choose creature, spell, or fortune, and your opponent cannot play cards of that type. This means that if your opponent has an empty board for some reason, they have not played creatures, you can play a Wasteland, and on their next turn they're not going to be able to play any more creatures. For the most part, you're always choosing creature here because you want to deny as many cards on the board as possible. So this card, you can just imagine, is very effective for 2 reasons. The first is that it keeps cards in your opponent's hand because they can't play them on the board, and that also helps you deal damage. And the second part is by denying them that board control, you're also saving damage on yourself, which is going to prevent you from having to use stone shields and other cards like that. So Wasteland is a very, very effective card. Definitely, if I had a 4th Wasteland, I would be using it, but I don't. But that's okay. We can make it work with 3, no problem. And the last fortune in the deck is the Throne of Renewal, which lets you return every card on the battleground to their owner's hand. The downside is you lose all of your resources, but that's generally not a problem because you can spend them first. But what this means is you can't use a throne and then immediately after use a wasteland. But even so, this throne is basically the best card in the deck. This saves you every time you draw it. If you have 5 destiny, you can automatically send everything back and you buy yourself a free turn, which in this deck, any turn you buy for yourself is going to help you get to the point where you can play more POW in 1 turn with Cyriius Legion, or it's going to give you more resources to play Tower of Oblivion plus a few POW. Any turn you save yourself in a control deck is crucial for you. So using these thrones, I only have 3 of them. You should always have 4. But yeah, I'll be using 3 of these thrones and recycling them with my other fortune, Asha Uses All. and yeah, that's gonna help establish board control, or I guess make it so your opponent can't have board control. And yeah, this is your #1 bailout card right here. Now for events, it's very straightforward. The first event you have 4 of is Week of Austerity. This makes it so when your opponents play creatures that cost 4 or less, they have to pay 1 extra resource for them. And potentially if they don't have enough resources, they're taking damage as well. So this slows down your opponent's deployment, which is crucial. And at the same time, it can slowly whittle away at their remaining health as well. Both aspects of it are quite nice. And the next card is Celebrations, which you spend 2 resources and each player draws a card. This is surprisingly the other crucial element of the deck. Not only because you get to draw your own card, which is always nice because you need more cards when you're playing a control deck, so you have more options, but it also makes your opponent draw a card, which is exactly what you want, because that will help your Tower of Oblivion deal more damage when you decide to play it. And that is every card in the deck. All of them help synergize with each other. They either buy you time to set up for your POW combo, or they force your opponent to either not be able to play his cards, or they make him draw cards. Either way, they all synergize well, and the whole point of the entire deck is to slow your opponent down to the point where they can't kill you, and eventually, if you can clear the board, you can completely keep it empty until you're able to kill them off with Tower of Oblivion and a few POW.